Tonight, as you settle into the quietness of your rest, we journey through the mist-laden paths of medieval Europe to discover one of history's most profound spiritual migrations, the Camino de Santiago, a network of pilgrimage routes spanning thousands of kilometers across the Iberian Peninsula, holds secrets woven into ancient stone, whispered through centuries of footsteps, and preserved in the architectural marvels that still stand sentinel over the Spanish landscape. By the time we reach the end of our exploration, you will understand how a single shrine in a remote corner of Spain became the destination for millions of seekers across centuries, drawing them across mountains, across rivers, across entire regions of the continent. But first, we must travel backward through time to the moment when legend and history began to intertwine beneath the northern Spanish sky. Imagine, if you will, a landscape transformed by centuries of devotion. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a vast, rolling terrain where rocky outcrops break through golden grasslands, where the air carries the scent of eucalyptus and wild herbs released by the warmth of the afternoon sun. Ancient stone markers worn smooth by countless hands over generations dot the pathways that thread through this terrain. The ground itself tells stories. Sections paved with river stones show the wear patterns of millions of footsteps, some smooth as glass from the pressure of centuries, others still sharp-edged where the passage has been less frequent. The sky above shifts between deep purple blue in early morning to brilliant azure by midday, and the clouds that gather over distant mountains seem to move with purpose, as if guiding travelers toward their destination. This is the physical reality of the Camino, a landscape that has witnessed transformation across more than 1,000 years of continuous human movement and spiritual seeking. The Camino de Santiago represents far more than a simple walking route. It embodies a remarkable convergence of religious devotion, architectural development, economic exchange, and cultural identity that shaped medieval and early modern Europe in ways that continue to resonate today. The routes themselves are not arbitrary paths scratched across a map, but rather the result of centuries of refinement, marked by the collective wisdom of countless pilgrims who discovered the most efficient passages through challenging terrain, the safest crossings at river valleys, and the locations where communities grew specifically to serve the needs of these spiritual travelers. Yet beneath this visible infrastructure lies a deeper complexity, the story of how a specific religious tradition, combined with cultural identity and economic incentive, created a phenomenon that would persist across centuries of political upheaval, religious conflict, and social transformation. To understand the Camino de Santiago, we must first acknowledge the interplay between historical documentation and devotional tradition that surrounds its origins. The tradition holds that St. James the Greater, one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, traveled to the Iberian Peninsula in the 1st century of the Common Era to spread Christian teachings. According to medieval Christian narratives, James performed miracles among the peninsula's inhabitants, converting many to Christianity before returning to the Levant and eventually being martyred in Jerusalem around 44 CE. Yet, the historical evidence for his presence in Spain is ambiguous. Early Christian sources from the Mediterranean world do not consistently mention such a mission, and much of what we know comes from much later medieval sources that were composed centuries after the events they describe. What we can verify with greater certainty is that by the 8th century, a shrine dedicated to St. James had emerged in the remote region of Galicia, in the northwestern corner of the Iberian Peninsula. This timing is significant, as it coincides with a period of profound religious transformation across medieval Europe. The early 9th century brought a dramatic claim that would reshape the religious landscape of the region. Church authorities in Galicia announced that the tomb of St. James had been discovered, hidden beneath the earth after his martyrdom, and lost to history for centuries. The announcement came at a moment when northwestern Spain was actively engaged in the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian effort to reclaim territory from Islamic rule and reorganize Christian kingdoms across the peninsula. In this context, the rediscovery of a major apostolic shrine represented more than a spiritual treasure. It offered religious legitimacy to Christian kingdoms and provided a symbol of continuity with the apostolic age and early Christian tradition. The location itself held profound significance. Galicia, at the western edge of the known Christian world, became transformed by this religious claim. Medieval maps and descriptions often depicted the world as a kind of cosmic order, with Jerusalem at the center, Rome as the seat of Christian authority, and other significant sites arranged around them. Santiago de Compostela, the Field of the Star, as the name translates, represented the western boundary of this Christian world. The symbolism was powerful and multivalent. A shrine marking the absolute limit of Western Christendom, dedicated to an apostle who had traveled the earth spreading the faith, located in a region now being reclaimed through military and spiritual effort. The geographical remoteness, which might have seemed like a disadvantage, instead became an attraction, marking it as a place fundamentally separated from ordinary worldly concerns and thus peculiarly suited to spiritual pilgrimage. By the 10th century, the cult of St. James had begun attracting pilgrims from across Christian Europe. These early journeyers traveled not by organized route, but by following general directions, seeking guidance from local inhabitants, and relying on religious intuition and whatever documentation existed. The voyage was extraordinarily arduous. Pilgrims from distant regions might spend months or even years in transit, facing dangers from bandits, wild animals, disease, harsh weather, and the simple physical exhaustion of traveling on foot through unmapped and partially civilized territory. Yet the number of pilgrims gradually increased, drawn by the spiritual magnetism of a major Christian shrine, the cultural prestige of completing such a demanding journey, and in many cases, a genuine devotional fervor that outweighed the practical hardships involved. The true transformation of the Camino into an organized pilgrimage infrastructure occurred during the 11th century, a period that witnessed remarkable developments across medieval Christian Europe. This was the era of the First Crusade, of monastic reform movements that emphasized spiritual renewal, and of increasing economic development and trade across European regions. It was also the period when the Reconquista was achieving major military successes, expanding Christian-controlled territory across the Iberian Peninsula at a more rapid pace than had characterized the preceding centuries. The shrine at Santiago de Compostela, located in the northernmost reaches of successful Christian reconquest, became increasingly prominent in Christian consciousness, and the journey to the shrine became recognized as a form of spiritual discipline, equivalent to pilgrimage to Rome or to the Holy Land itself. A crucial development occurred when various religious orders, particularly the monastic communities that had grown wealthy and influential across medieval Europe, began to organize support systems specifically for Santiago pilgrims. The Cluniac order, which had emerged in France and spread across Europe, bringing reform and increased standardization to monastic practice, took a particular interest in the Santiago pilgrimage. Cluniac monasteries had established communities across France and the Iberian Peninsula, and these institutions began to create infrastructure dedicated to accommodating pilgrims. Monasteries along the emerging routes began to provide shelter, meals, and spiritual guidance. Hospitals were established, initially very simple facilities offering basic care, but representing an important acknowledgement that pilgrims needed assistance beyond what casual charity could provide. These institutions represented a formalization of what had previously been ad hoc efforts by local communities to welcome religious travelers. The economic implications of this pilgrimage infrastructure were profound and far-reaching. Communities that lay along pilgrimage routes began to develop specialized services and infrastructure designed specifically to serve travelers. Merchants discovered opportunity in the needs of pilgrims. Those undertaking such extended journeys required food, replacement clothing, shoes, tools, and various supplies that could be sold by local traders. Craftspeople began to specialize in producing goods for pilgrims, sturdy shoes capable of withstanding thousands of kilometers of walking, durable clothing made from materials that could withstand diverse weather conditions and frequent washing, and devotional items, including badges and tokens, that pilgrims could acquire to prove their completion of the journey. This economic specialization represented a significant development in medieval commerce, demonstrating how religious practices could generate sustained economic activity across multiple regions and communities. The route itself, or more accurately, the complex network of routes that gradually unified into what became known as the Camino Francés and other established paths, solidified during this period. Pilgrims arriving from distant regions, particularly those from France and other northern European areas, followed roughly similar paths that took them through the French countryside, across the Pyrenees into Spanish territory, and then across northern Spain toward Galicia. These routes were not engineered according to any centralized plan, but rather developed organically as pilgrims and their guides discovered combinations of pathways that balanced directness against the availability of shelter, water, and community resources. Over generations, certain routes became established by custom and repeated use, marked by guidebooks that began to appear in the 12th century and eventually formalized through institutional documentation and support. The rise of Santiago pilgrimage coincided with and deeply influenced one of the great artistic and architectural movements of medieval Europe, the Romanesque style. This architectural language, characterized by rounded arches, sturdy pillars, decorated capitals, and emphasis on horizontal lines and modest height, emerged across Europe during the 11th and 12th centuries and dominated sacred architecture for roughly 2 centuries. The connection between pilgrimage and Romanesque architecture was intimate and direct. Church design began to incorporate specific features that acknowledged and accommodated the needs and expectations of pilgrims. Larger interior spaces allowed for the circulation of crowds of visitors who needed to view holy relics and sacred sites within the churches. The development of the ambulatory, a passage that circulated around the apse and behind the main altar, represented a direct architectural response to pilgrimage practice. Pilgrims moving through such churches followed established paths that moved them through the sacred interior space, in a way that allowed everyone to progress and view the objects of veneration without disrupting the liturgical activities that continued in the choir and main altar area. The Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela itself, begun in the 11th century and largely completed by the early 12th century, stands as a supreme expression of Romanesque pilgrimage architecture. The building rises from the landscape with commanding presence, its stone walls and towers creating a silhouette that would have been visible to pilgrims from considerable distances as they approached across the final stages of their journey. The interior embraces pilgrims with particular intentionality. High, soaring nave arcades create a sense of spiritual elevation, while the substantial width of the nave allows for the movement of crowds without creating the sense of congestion that would be present in a smaller sacred space. The sculptural decoration of the cathedral tells theological narratives and displays the artistic sophistication of the medieval Iberian Peninsula, with scenes from scripture and hagiography rendered in stone with remarkable detail and emotional depth. Along the pilgrimage routes themselves, architecture responded to the needs of traveling communities in ways both functional and symbolic. Wayside churches, often modest in scale but displaying Romanesque ornamentation, were spaced at distances that reflected the typical daily walking distances achievable by medieval pilgrims. These churches served multiple functions. They provided shelter from weather, opportunities for prayer and spiritual renewal, and connection to the institutional church that organized and validated pilgrimage practice. The presence of a church along the route conveyed an important message to pilgrims, that their journey had meaning recognized and endorsed by the established church hierarchy, and that they were moving through landscape that had been claimed by and organized according to Christian understanding of sacred geography. Monasteries and hospices developed distinctive architectural features that reflected their specialized role in the pilgrimage economy. Pilgrim hospices typically incorporated a large common room where travelers could gather, long dormitory spaces where many individuals could sleep under a single roof, and kitchens and storage areas larger than would be required for the community that normally inhabited the location. The architectural layout reflected a particular understanding of pilgrimage support. Pilgrims were to be welcomed efficiently, cared for collectively rather than individually, and moved onward according to the rhythms of pilgrimage, rather than integrated into the permanent community. This architectural expression of pilgrimage principles conveyed an important social reality. Pilgrims were sacred and deserving of support, yet they remained fundamentally external to the settled communities they passed through, moving through the landscape as continuous travelers rather than becoming part of the places they visited. As the 12th century progressed, the Santiago pilgrimage grew dramatically in scale and became increasingly systematized. The routes developed more formal documentation, including early guidebooks that described the stages of the journey, the distances between settlements, and the characteristics of different regions. The most famous of these was the Codex Calixtinus, a manuscript compiled in the 12th century that included descriptions of the pilgrimage, accounts of miracles associated with St. James, and practical information for pilgrims. The Codex Calixtinus represents an important development in medieval documentation, the creation of systematic written knowledge about pilgrimage that could be transmitted independent of direct personal experience. Pilgrims preparing for their journey could acquire or consult such documents, obtaining information about what to expect that was more reliable than hearsay or rumor. The expansion of Santiago pilgrimage during this period reflected broader developments in medieval Christianity and society. The late 11th and 12th centuries witnessed the emergence of new forms of religious practice and devotion, including increased veneration of saints and their relics, the development of new monastic orders that emphasized poverty and spiritual reform, and a growing sense that individual spiritual experience and personal devotion were significant dimensions of faith. Pilgrimage, in this context, represented a spiritually powerful practice that combined physical discipline with spiritual seeking, demonstrating commitment through bodily exertion and privation. The extension of such commitment across vast distances and over extended time periods made Santiago pilgrimage particularly significant as a demonstration of religious devotion. Yet the expansion also reflected economic and social factors beyond purely spiritual motivation. By the 12th century, medieval Europe had entered a period of increased economic development, population growth, and expansion of trade networks. More people had the resources and flexibility to undertake extended journeys, and the infrastructure to support such journeys was becoming more developed. Additionally, pilgrimage offered forms of status and identity that appealed to varied social classes. For nobility and wealth merchants, pilgrimage demonstrated piety and cultural sophistication. For those of more modest circumstances, pilgrimage offered the possibility of spiritual standing that did not depend on wealth or social position within the settled hierarchy. The badges and tokens that pilgrims acquired at Santiago represented tangible proof of their spiritual achievement and could be worn or displayed for the remainder of their lives. The relationship between Santiago pilgrimage and other major Christian pilgrimage destinations became increasingly formalized during this period. Within Christian theology and practice, 3 sites held particular significance: Jerusalem, where the life of Jesus had occurred; Rome, the seat of papal authority and location of the tombs of Saints Peter and Paul; and Santiago de Compostela, the burial site of St. James. These 3 destinations became recognized as the primary pilgrimage destinations for Western Christians, and the completion of pilgrimage to all 3 locations represented the highest form of Christian pilgrimage devotion. Some pilgrims undertook all 3 journeys at different periods of their lives, while others traveled to multiple sites within a single extended pilgrimage. This hierarchy of pilgrimage sites reflected important theological convictions about Christian history and the authority structure of the medieval church, while simultaneously creating incentives for continued development of pilgrimage infrastructure and routes. To truly understand the Camino de Santiago, one must imaginatively reconstruct the daily reality of pilgrimage as it was experienced by medieval travelers. A typical day in the life of a Santiago pilgrim would begin before dawn, as the pilgrimage community rose from sleep in whatever shelter they had found or created. The darkness before sunrise carried particular atmosphere. The temperature would be cool, sometimes cold, depending on the season and regional location, and the landscape would be transformed by darkness into something partially unknown. Pilgrims might hear sounds that were difficult to identify in the darkness: the movement of wind through trees and grass, the occasional sound of distant animals or of the pilgrim community stirring to prepare for the day's journey, the smell of the earth in early morning, the release of plant scents from overnight moisture, and the smoke from cooking fires being rekindled would mark the transition into the beginning of active pilgrimage. Breakfast would likely be simple: bread, perhaps dried fruit or cheese if available, and water or weak ale. The preparation and consumption of this meal would occur in semi-darkness if no shelter was available, or in the communal spaces of a monastery or hospice if lodging had been found. The physical sensation of eating after a long rest, the gradual warming of the body as food was consumed, and heat gradually built in the core, and the mental preparation for another day of extended walking characterized this morning transition. Pilgrims would check their footwear, examining it for damage sustained during previous days of travel, attempting repairs where necessary. Shoes were critical tools for pilgrimage. A pilgrim whose footwear failed might find their journey imperiled, as medieval roadways were rough and muddy, and extended walking without protection left feet vulnerable to injury, infection, and incapacity. The actual process of walking, perhaps 20 to 30 kilometers per day, though distances varied depending on terrain, weather, and individual capability, represented the fundamental activity of pilgrimage. The rhythm of walking would have been meditative and potentially hypnotic, with individual footsteps blending into a continuous pattern of movement across the landscape. Pilgrims would move through terrain varying from flat agricultural areas to rising foothills to mountain passes, experiencing the landscape through the immediacy of their bodies in motion. The physical sensations would shift throughout the day. Initial freshness in early morning gradually giving way to accumulated fatigue, the warming of muscles and joints as activity continued, and eventually the development of pain, soreness, and the intense desire for rest that would build toward the end of the day's journey. The landscape itself would unfold gradually, with distant mountains appearing and gradually growing closer, with river valleys opening suddenly in the topography, with the appearance and disappearance of forests and open grasslands. Medieval pilgrims would have experienced the sensory richness of the environment with directness that is difficult to imagine in the modern era. The smell of soil after rain, the sound of birds and insects, the texture of grass beneath their feet, transitioning to rocky outcrops, the visual shift in vegetation as altitude increased or soil composition changed. Seasons would mark the pilgrimage experience dramatically. Spring pilgrims would encounter landscapes transformed by recent rain and bursting with new growth. Summer travelers would face intense heat and the dust that accumulated on roadways. Autumn pilgrims would move through landscapes in transition toward dormancy, and winter travelers would confront snow and ice, extreme cold, and physical danger from weather conditions. The midday period would typically involve a pause for rest and sustenance. In many cases, pilgrims would find some form of shelter, a wayside cross or small chapel, a copse of trees providing shade and protection from sun or rain. Food consumed at midday would often be similar to breakfast. Bread, perhaps supplemented with dried or preserved foods that pilgrims had acquired or that had been provided by the communities they passed through. The physical sensation of rest after hours of walking would be profound. The relief as weight was shifted from feet to ground, as strained muscles relaxed slightly, as the mind transitioned from the focus required for sustained travel to a more dispersed awareness. In warm seasons, the midday rest might be extended, with pilgrims dozing in the shade as their bodies recovered from the morning's exertion. As afternoon progressed and evening approached, the search for lodging would become increasingly urgent and focused. Pilgrims would seek to reach a settlement with a monastery, hospice, or established pilgrim accommodation before darkness fell. the appearance of a building in the distance, the rectangular form of a church tower, the silhouette of walls against the sky, would carry profound emotional significance. Drawing near to shelter after a long day of walking, the sensory experience would intensify. The sound of voices and activity from the settlement, the smell of smoke and cooking fires, the sight of other people and confirmation that the day's journey had been successfully completed. Entry into the pilgrim accommodation would bring dramatic sensory shifts. The transition from the open air to enclosed spaces, the different acoustic environment of interior spaces, the concentrated smell of many humans in a closed area, the heat and smoke from cooking fires, and multiple bodies in close proximity. Evening activities would revolve around basic self-maintenance and spiritual practice. Pilgrims would wash their feet if water was available, attending to blisters, cuts, and injuries that had accumulated during the day's travel. Communal meals would be consumed, often in silence in religious communities, or with conversation and information exchange in secular accommodations. Stories would be shared about the road behind and ahead, advice given about challenges anticipated in coming days, and connections would form between pilgrims from diverse origins who found themselves in temporary community. Some pilgrims would attend evening prayers or services in the chapel or church associated with their lodging. Most would retire early, exhausted by the day's physical exertion and seeking to build strength for the following day. Sleep in pilgrim accommodation would be deep and often uninterrupted, though the presence of many bodies in close proximity meant that sleep would involve ambient awareness of others, quiet sounds of movement, occasional coughs or snoring, the subtle shifts in temperature as others moved around the dormitory space. The Camino de Santiago was never a single unified route, but rather a complex network of pathways that gradually developed recognizable main routes, supplemented by numerous variations and alternative passages. The primary route that eventually became known as the Camino Francés emerged as the most heavily traveled and most thoroughly documented path, originating from France and crossing the Pyrenees before sweeping across northern Spain toward the ultimate destination. Yet even this main route encompassed numerous variations and alternative branches, and parallel routes developed to serve pilgrims from other regions or those seeking different landscapes and experiences. Understanding these varied routes provides insight into how medieval geography, settlement patterns, and practical considerations shaped pilgrimage experience. The Camino Francés typically began in France, with pilgrims converging from throughout Europe toward French territory and then proceeding according to one of several possible French pathways. Some pilgrims arrived from northeastern Europe, traveling through the Low Countries and the Rhine Valley before arriving in France. Others came from Italy or the Mediterranean regions, traveling northward through difficult mountain terrain. Still others originated in France itself, gathered around important pilgrimage staging centers like Le Puy-en-Velay, where a significant church dedicated to the Virgin Mary served as an additional pilgrimage destination and departure point for the Santiago journey. Pilgrims gathering at these staging centers would join together into loose associations for the extended journey ahead, finding safety in numbers and practical benefit through shared knowledge and resources. The crossing of the Pyrenees represented one of the most challenging and symbolically significant portions of the journey. The mountains rose before pilgrims as a physical barrier between France and the Iberian Peninsula, a natural frontier that marked a genuine transition between the Christian kingdoms of France and the Christian-held territory of northern Spain. The Pyrenees crossing involved substantial elevation change, difficult terrain, exposure to weather extremes, and real danger from avalanche, rockfall, sudden storm, and the simple exposure of high-altitude travel in the medieval period. Pilgrims ascending toward the high passes would experience dramatic shifts in temperature, in air density, in vegetation, as the landscape transformed from the relatively lush French side to the more austere Spanish side. The psychological significance of crossing such a prominent geographical feature would have been substantial. Pilgrims might understand their Pyrenees crossing as a liminal experience, a threshold between different worlds, and a transformative moment in their pilgrimage journey. On the Spanish side of the Pyrenees, the established routes descended into the valleys and river systems of northern Spain, moving through Navarre and then into Castile-Leon. The landscape here displayed characteristics quite different from the French territories pilgrims had traversed. The Spanish regions were frontier zones, characterized by ongoing conflict between Christian kingdoms and Islamic principalities that still controlled portions of the peninsula. The architecture, settlement patterns, and cultural practices reflected this frontier reality. Many communities showed evidence of recent Christian reconquest or settlement, with newly constructed churches and castles rising from the landscape. The physical infrastructure for pilgrim support was less developed than in France, requiring communities to improvise accommodations and support systems. Yet this frontier character also gave the Spanish portions of the pilgrimage particular spiritual significance. Pilgrims understood themselves as moving through territories being reclaimed for Christianity, and the spiritual importance of Santiago's shrine was intimately connected to the religious and military efforts to expand Christian territory. The region of Castile-Leon, through which the main route passed, displayed the characteristics of medieval Iberian civilization in significant detail. Towns and villages showed architectural styles mixing Romanesque church building with fortress construction, reflecting both spiritual and military concerns. Settlements were often arranged around a central church, with the church building itself sometimes displaying defensive characteristics such as fortified towers that could serve as refuge if the community came under attack. The landscape itself was partly cultivated agricultural terrain, mixed with uncultivated areas and regions of forest. Rivers carved valleys through the rolling terrain, and these river valleys often marked the locations where settlements clustered, as water access was crucial for human habitation, and the rivers themselves could serve as defensive barriers or boundaries between territories. As pilgrims progressed westward across Castile-Leon, the landscape gradually transformed. The terrain became more rolling and less dramatic. The vegetation shifted in composition, and the air quality and light developed the characteristics of the Atlantic coast region. The approach toward Galicia, the final destination, would have involved crossing into terrain that became progressively more verdant and wet, with increased rainfall and denser vegetation than the drier regions of central Spain. The landscape of Galicia itself displayed distinctive characteristics, hillier and more forested than the central Spanish plateau, with abundant water and green vegetation, reflecting greater precipitation. This striking landscape shift would have provided dramatic confirmation to pilgrims that they were approaching their destination, that the landscape itself was transforming to mark their arrival in this remote and sacred region. The spiritual experience of Santiago pilgrimage involved layered dimensions of religious practice, personal transformation, and institutional religious meaning. For pilgrims themselves, the journey represented an opportunity to demonstrate religious devotion through physical discipline and the undertaking of genuine hardship and danger. Medieval Christian theology emphasized the redemptive potential of suffering, and pilgrimage offered a structured context within which bodily suffering could be understood as spiritually productive. The pain of walking, the hunger experienced when food was limited or of poor quality, the cold of winter nights in inadequate shelter, the fear of bandits and dangerous wildlife, and the general physical exhaustion of extended travel were not mere unfortunate side effects, but potentially meaningful dimensions of the spiritual experience. Pilgrims understood their bodily suffering as participation in the suffering of Christ and of the saints, as a form of bodily prayer that complemented, or in some cases, substituted for verbal prayer. The presence of saints' relics and the veneration of saints represented crucial dimensions of medieval pilgrimage spirituality. Saint James, to whom the Santiago shrine was dedicated, was believed to possess particular powers of intercession with the divine. Pilgrims approaching the shrine carried expectations that proximity to the saint's remains would bring spiritual benefit, healing of physical ailments, forgiveness of sins, or the saint's assistance in addressing particular concerns or life challenges. The physical experience of proximity to the shrine, the moment of entering the cathedral, approaching the altar where the saint's tomb was reputed to be located, experiencing the space where the saint's remains rested, would have carried immense emotional and spiritual significance. The sensory experience of the cathedral itself, the smell of incense and stone, the acoustics of the vast interior space, the visual presentation of light through windows, and the architectural framework of the sacred space would have reinforced the spiritually transformative significance of the pilgrimage destination. Yet alongside these individual dimensions of spiritual experience, Santiago pilgrimage carried institutional significance for the medieval church. The pilgrimage demonstrated the authority of the church to organize masses of people and direct their behavior toward religiously significant ends. The pilgrimage network required hierarchical organization, decisions about route development, about the location of hospices, about the allocation of ecclesiastical authority and resource to support pilgrimage, all flowed from institutional church leadership. The accumulation of resources through the donations of pilgrims and the economic activity generated by pilgrimage provided significant financial support for various ecclesiastical institutions. The widespread veneration of St. James and the assertion of his tomb's authenticity at Santiago reinforced claims about the continuity of Christian tradition from apostolic times to the medieval present, supporting theological arguments about the historical rootedness of contemporary Christian practice. Prayer and devotional practices shaped pilgrimage experience in continuous ways. Many pilgrims would have recited standardized prayers at specific locations or times. The Hail Mary, the Lord's Prayer, and other memorized formulas would have filled mental space during extended periods of walking, creating a rhythmic interior experience that complemented the bodily rhythm of walking itself. Some pilgrims would have used prayer beads or rosaries, devices that facilitated structured prayer practice and provided tactile focus for devotional attention. The repetition of prayers and the use of ritualized devotional objects created a meditative quality to pilgrimage, allowing the mind to settle into patterns of thought that emphasized connection to the divine and spiritual intention rather than the concerns of everyday life. This interior spiritual practice would have been invisible to external observers, but would have represented a crucial dimension of pilgrimage experience for many participants. The veneration of St. James connected to broader medieval Iberian concerns in complex ways. In the context of the Reconquista, St. James became identified with the religious legitimacy of Christian efforts to expand Christian territory and reclaim formerly Christian lands. Some traditions developed depicting St. James as a military figure who appeared in battles on the side of Christian forces, lending divine support to Christian military efforts. This transformation of St. James from primarily a spiritual figure into something approaching a military patron reflected the way pilgrimage was embedded in the broader context of Christian expansion and religious reconquest. Yet this military dimension represented only one aspect of the pilgrimage's meaning. For most pilgrims, the spiritual and personal dimensions of the journey would have been primary, with the military and territorial concerns of Christian kingdoms remaining background context rather than primary motivation. Medieval pilgrims developed distinctive material cultures and forms of personal adornment that marked their status as pilgrimage undertakers and demonstrated their commitment to the pilgrimage vocation. The most iconic symbol became the scallop shell, which pilgrims would acquire at or near the Santiago shrine and carry with them as tangible proof of pilgrimage completion. The scallop shell carried multiple layers of symbolic meaning. It represented the sea and the pilgrimage's connection to the Atlantic coast. It displayed characteristics of opening and reveal that paralleled the spiritual opening and transformation of pilgrimage itself, and its durability meant that shells could be preserved and displayed for years after pilgrimage completion. Pilgrims might sew shells onto their clothing, carry them as part of their traveling equipment, or arrange them in their homes after returning to their communities. The shell became so associated with Santiago pilgrimage that it eventually appeared in artwork and heraldry as a universal symbol of pilgrimage itself. Beyond the scallop shell, pilgrims accumulated various badges, tokens, and devotional objects. Small metal or lead badges depicting St. James or the shrine at Santiago could be purchased and worn or carried. These badges served both spiritual and social functions. They reinforced the pilgrim's connection to the saint and the shrine. They demonstrated publicly the pilgrim's religious devotion, and they provided tangible evidence that could be displayed to prove pilgrimage completion. The accumulation of badges from multiple religious destinations created a complex personal material record of pilgrimage achievement, and some pilgrims would have adorned themselves heavily with the accumulated tokens of multiple spiritual journeys. Wooden staffs became associated with pilgrimage, serving practical functions in facilitating movement across difficult terrain, while also functioning symbolically as markers of pilgrim identity. Staffs might be inscribed with names of pilgrimage destinations or with personal marker, and they could be left at shrine locations as offerings or carried back home as mementos of the journey. Clothing worn by pilgrims also developed distinctive characteristics. The extended journey required durable clothing that could withstand frequent wear and frequent washing. Practical considerations drove clothing choices. Sturdy fabrics, neutral colors that did not show dirt readily, styles that allowed freedom of movement and adjustment for varying climate conditions. Yet clothing also carried symbolic dimensions. Certain styles became associated with pilgrim identity, marking those wearing them as undertaking pilgrimage rather than merely traveling. Cloaks or capes worn over other garments provided both practical protection from weather and visual distinction that marked the wearer as a pilgrim. Hats or head coverings protected from sun and rain, while also providing visual markers of pilgrim status. These material dimensions of pilgrim identity were not merely personal. They created visual recognition within communities, allowing local inhabitants to identify approaching pilgrims and potentially triggering the hospitality and support that had become normative responses to pilgrims' presence. The transformation of ordinary individuals into recognized pilgrims through material culture represented an important dimension of pilgrimage social practice. A person leaving their home community to undertake the Santiago journey would need to acquire or prepare the material equipment necessary for the journey, and this process involved substantial practical and potentially symbolic investment. The acquisition of a sturdy staff, the preparation or procurement of appropriate clothing, the gathering of small amounts of food or provisions for the initial stages of travel, and potentially the acquisition of a scallop shell token or a credential letter from one's home church. These material preparations marked the transformation of a person from ordinary community member to pilgrim undertaking a sacred journey. The material apparatus of pilgrimage thus created a visible marker of identity change and signaled to others and to oneself that a profound transformation in status and activity was underway. The passage of thousands of pilgrims across the territories of northern Spain and the Iberian Peninsula generated profound impacts on the communities they traversed. Towns and villages that lay along established pilgrimage routes experienced dramatic transformations as they adapted to serve pilgrim populations. Infrastructure developed specifically to accommodate traveling populations. Hospices and pilgrimage shelters were constructed, often with support from ecclesiastical authorities and sometimes from lay communities, seeking the prestige and economic benefit of providing services to pilgrims. Shops and market stalls developed to sell goods specifically designed for pilgrims' needs. Food appropriate for traveling consumption, replacement clothing and footwear, devotional items, and provisions for ongoing travel. The economic activity generated by pilgrims created employment for local craftspeople, shopkeepers, and service providers. Towns that developed significant pilgrim infrastructure underwent architectural and social transformations. Streets might be widened to accommodate the passage of pilgrim groups. Plazas were created or expanded to serve as gathering spaces and market areas where pilgrims could obtain supplies and information. Water sources, crucial for pilgrim survival and hygiene, were brought into town centers and marked with fountains or public basins. The presence of a well-organized hospice or series of pilgrim accommodations became a source of civic pride and identified a settlement as a significant point on the pilgrimage route. Some towns developed reputations for particular forms of service or hospitality, and these reputations would be transmitted between pilgrims, shaping the expectations and behaviors of subsequent travelers. The social composition of communities was influenced by the presence of pilgrim populations. Young people sought employment serving pilgrims, creating economic opportunities that might not have existed in the absence of pilgrimage. Travelers could potentially remain in communities after their pilgrimage journey or spiritual purpose was completed, contributing skills and labor to the permanent population. Information, news, and cultural exchange moved with pilgrim populations, allowing communities to access knowledge about distant regions and current events beyond their immediate locality. Religious enthusiasm generated by contact with pilgrims and reinforcement of pilgrimage devotion could encourage local community members to undertake pilgrimage themselves, creating secondary cycles of travel and religious commitment. Yet the integration of pilgrims into communities also created tensions and challenges. large populations of transient travelers could strain local resources, particularly during peak pilgrimage seasons, when many pilgrims passed through in close succession. Conflicts could arise between pilgrims and permanent residents over access to resources, behavioral norms, and the appropriate treatment of travelers. Some communities became renowned for the mistreatment of pilgrims, with historical sources and pilgrim accounts describing instances of robbery, assault, or unfair commercial practices targeting vulnerable travelers. The power imbalance between transient pilgrims and organized permanent communities meant that pilgrims had limited ability to seek redress for mistreatment, and some travelers inevitably experienced hostility or exploitation rather than hospitality. The integration of pilgrimage into the religious, social, and economic fabric of communities created feedback loops that sustained and expanded the pilgrimage phenomenon. As pilgrimage expanded, the infrastructure to support it expanded, which in turn made pilgrimage more feasible and safer for future pilgrims, which led to further expansion in pilgrimage numbers. The economic benefits experienced by communities along established routes created incentives for communities to invest further in pilgrim infrastructure and to seek to position themselves along or near the primary pilgrimage pathways. Information and stories about successful pilgrimage experiences, dangerous sections of the route, and particularly hospitable communities circulated through networks of pilgrims returning home and through written accounts that became increasingly available as pilgrimage documentation proliferated. The Camino de Santiago existed within a medieval Mediterranean world characterized by significant religious and cultural diversity. The Iberian Peninsula itself represented one of the most religiously complex regions of medieval Europe, with Christian territories coexisting alongside Islamic Al-Andalus, with Jewish communities maintaining significant cultural and intellectual presence throughout the peninsula, and with complex histories of cultural exchange and conflict between these different religious communities. Pilgrims traveling across this landscape encountered religious diversity in immediate and sometimes startling ways, and these encounters influenced how pilgrims understood the religious significance of their journey and the broader religious meaning of Christian identity. The Reconquista context meant that many portions of the pilgrimage routes passed through frontier regions where Christian and Islamic territories were in active conflict or in recently stabilized territorial division. Some pilgrims would have traveled routes that actually passed through territories controlled by Islamic rulers, particularly in earlier centuries when the southern portions of the peninsula remained under Islamic control. The physical experience of moving through landscape under non-Christian political control, of encountering Muslim inhabitants and Islamic cultural practices, represented a tangible dimension of pilgrimage experience that reinforced the journey's religious significance. Pilgrimage thus connected to broader medieval Christian consciousness about religious identity, defined in opposition to Islam, and the journey to Santiago represented a form of engagement with the Christian-Islamic frontier that was central to medieval Iberian identity. Jewish communities maintained significant presence throughout medieval Iberia, and pilgrims traveling across established routes would have encountered Jewish-majority neighborhoods, synagogues, and communities. The complex relationship between Christian pilgrimage devotion and Jewish presence in the same towns created interesting tensions and sometimes cooperation. Some Jewish communities provided services to pilgrims, while others maintained social distance from the Christian devotional activities surrounding pilgrimage. In later medieval centuries, escalating Christian religious intolerance would eventually transform these relationships, with Jewish expulsion and persecution becoming tragic dimensions of medieval and early modern Iberian history. Yet during much of the high medieval period of Santiago pilgrimage's development, Jewish and Christian communities coexisted with significant cultural exchange, despite underlying religious differences and occasional conflicts. The encounter with non-Christian and non-European cultures represented a significant dimension of pilgrimage experience for participants from distant northern European regions. Pilgrims arriving from France, Germany, and other northern territories were encountering a landscape with Mediterranean characteristics, different architectural styles, different food and plant species, and different cultural practices. The Iberian Peninsula represented the boundary between European and Mediterranean worlds, and for pilgrims from Northern Europe, traveling to Santiago involved engagement with cultural alterity that reinforced the journey's significance as a movement through fundamentally different worlds. The sensory experience of the Mediterranean landscape, the quality of light, the characteristics of vegetation, the arrangement of settlements, the character of urban environments, would have registered as substantially different from what Northern European pilgrims knew from their home regions. The multilingual character of the pilgrimage experience deserves acknowledgement. While Latin represented the official language of the Church and was understood by clergy throughout Christendom, pilgrims themselves spoke numerous different languages: French, various Germanic languages, Italian and other Romance languages, and the languages of the Iberian Peninsula created a linguistic landscape in which communication could be challenging. Pilgrims from different regions would have supported one another through the challenges of non-shared language, and the development of multilingual communities along the routes created unique cultural environments. The development of pilgrimage guides and documentation, particularly those in vernacular languages, represented an important aid to pilgrims navigating the linguistic challenges of long-distance travel through regions where their native language was not widely spoken. The Santiago pilgrimage existed within medieval Christianity as one expression of broader patterns of religious practice and theological understanding that characterized the period. The cult of saints and the veneration of relics represented central dimensions of medieval popular Christianity, and understanding the Santiago pilgrimage requires recognition of how deeply embedded these practices were in medieval Christian consciousness. Saints were understood as possessing continuing power and agency after their deaths, as able to intercede with the divine on behalf of those seeking their assistance, and as present in particular locations through their relics or in places dedicated to their memory. The distribution of power among multiple saints, the idea that different saints possessed different kinds of power or authority, and the belief that geographic proximity to saints' remains conveyed spiritual advantage, all shaped medieval Christian religious life and practice. Relic veneration served multiple functions in medieval Christian practice. Intellectually, relics provided tangible connection to Christian history and the apostolic age, offering physical confirmation that the claims of Christian theology about Jesus and the apostles were rooted in real people and real events. Theologically, relics served as sites where the division between the earthly and heavenly realms became permeable. In the presence of saints' relics, miracles could occur. Divine power could manifest in visible ways, and the boundary between material and spiritual reality became thin. Socially and politically, the possession of important relics provided prestige and authority to institutions and territories that housed them, which is why the relic of St. James at Santiago became so significant for Galician communities and Christian kingdoms seeking religious legitimacy and authority. The theological understanding of pilgrimage itself developed in sophisticated ways throughout the medieval period. pilgrimage was understood not merely as personal spiritual practice, but as participation in larger theological patterns. The idea of Christian life itself as pilgrimage, as a journey through the world toward ultimate heavenly destination, provided a theological framework within which physical pilgrimage practice could be understood as enacting spiritual reality. The discomforts and dangers of pilgrimage were understood as forms of the spiritual struggle that characterized Christian life. The goal of pilgrimage, arrival at a sacred site, was understood as anticipating the ultimate goal of Christian life, arrival at heavenly paradise. In this theological framework, pilgrimage to Santiago connected to broader medieval Christian understanding of human spiritual destiny and the meaning of embodied Christian practice. The concept of spiritual merit through pilgrimage developed in complex ways. Medieval Christianity maintained theological frameworks through which acts of piety and religious practice could generate spiritual benefit. The idea that particular actions, when undertaken with appropriate intention and sincere devotion, could strengthen one's spiritual standing and develop one's capacity for holiness. Pilgrimage, as a particularly demanding and visible form of religious practice, was understood as particularly productive of spiritual merit. This belief encouraged the undertaking of pilgrimage, as individuals sought to benefit spiritually from the spiritual effort and discipline the journey entailed. Yet these beliefs also connected to penitential traditions in medieval Christianity. The idea that pilgrimage could serve as a form of public penance, as a way of demonstrating genuine repentance for sin and seeking reconciliation with both community and divine. The relationship between Santiago pilgrimage and other forms of medieval spiritual practice deserves reflection. Monastery living, monastic spiritual discipline, mystical encounter with the divine, ascetic practice, and conventional parish-based Christian practice all represented different pathways within medieval Christianity. Santiago pilgrimage represented an alternative or complementary pathway, one particularly accessible to lay people who did not have the option or vocation for monastic life, yet sought to deepen their spiritual practice through demanding physical and spiritual discipline. The accessibility of pilgrimage to diverse social classes and the way it operated outside the formal institutional hierarchy of the Church made it represent a form of spiritual democratization, offering spiritual achievement possibilities to those not integrated into the formal ecclesiastical hierarchy. While the Camino Frances developed into the primary and most heavily traveled route to Santiago, numerous variations and alternative routes also emerged as pilgrimage expanded. These variations reflected diverse factors: the origins of pilgrims, who might prefer routes originating from their home regions, the seasonal availability of different passages, the desire to visit multiple pilgrimage sites within a single journey, and the individual choices of pilgrims seeking particular experiences or landscapes. Understanding the multiplicity of routes provides insight into how medieval geography, settlement patterns, and pilgrimage preferences shaped the overall pilgrimage phenomenon. The Camino Portuguese represented one significant alternative, originating in Portugal and proceeding northward through Portuguese and Galician territory before reaching Santiago. This route served pilgrims coming from Portugal and southern Iberia, allowing them to undertake pilgrimage without first traveling through France or crossing the Pyrenees. The Camino Portuguese was generally shorter than the Camino Frances and involved different terrain, passing through lower altitude regions and encountering different cultural and linguistic contexts. Pilgrims choosing the Portuguese route experienced distinctive landscapes and encountered communities with particular cultural characteristics, shaped by Portuguese rather than French or Northern Iberian influences. The Camino del Norte traced the northern coast of the Iberian Peninsula, passing through the coastal regions and encountering maritime landscapes quite different from the interior routes. This route involved different challenges. The coastal terrain could be rugged, and exposure to Atlantic weather was more intense than in interior routes. Yet the coastal route offered particular attractions: the opportunity to move along maritime landscapes, the presence of important ports and commercial centers that provided robust infrastructure for pilgrims, and the psychological significance of moving along the edge of the known European world toward the remote shrine at Santiago. Some historical sources suggest that this northern route was actually used more frequently in earlier medieval centuries, before the Camino Frances became predominant, though documentation of early route preferences is limited. The Camino de Madrid and other interior routes allowed pilgrims originating in central Iberia or arriving from Mediterranean ports to undertake pilgrimage without traveling through France. These routes generally involved longer overall distances and passage through less developed pilgrimage infrastructure, but they provided alternatives that might appeal to pilgrims with particular origins or preferences. The existence of multiple routes meant that pilgrimage could begin from diverse locations and follow varied pathways while still converging on the common destination at Santiago. This geographic flexibility meant that pilgrimage was accessible to a broader range of potential participants than would have been true if a single rigid route existed. In later medieval centuries, the concept of the roads to Santiago became increasingly systematized and documented. Guides describing multiple routes emerged, providing information about alternative pathways, their advantages and disadvantages, and the communities and infrastructure available along each route. The idea that multiple legitimate routes existed alongside a primary route became institutionally recognized, and the establishment of markings and way stations extended to alternative routes in addition to the primary Camino Frances. This expansion of marked and supported routes represented a maturing of pilgrimage infrastructure in which recognition of pilgrimage diversity was formalized into institutional structures and documentational practices. The medieval period witnessed numerous crises and disruptions that threatened the continuation of pilgrimage, yet the Santiago pilgrimage proved remarkably resilient. Periods of intense military conflict, including the Reconquista Wars that continued throughout the medieval period, created dangerous conditions along some portions of the routes. When warfare intensified in particular regions, pilgrimage numbers might decline along affected routes, or routes might be temporarily abandoned in favor of alternative pathways. Yet even during periods of intense conflict, evidence suggests that pilgrims continued to undertake the journey, demonstrating the powerful spiritual motivation that pilgrimage generated. Some pilgrims would have experienced military conflict directly, encountering armies in transit, potentially being robbed or conscripted by military forces, or finding infrastructure destroyed by warfare. Yet these dangers appear not to have eliminated pilgrimage, but rather to have become incorporated into the understood risks of the journey. Disease represented another significant challenge to pilgrimage. Epidemics and plagues swept through medieval Europe periodically, devastating populations and creating conditions of fear and social disruption. The Black Death of the 14th century and subsequent plague recurrences devastated medieval European populations, and these disease catastrophes must have dramatically disrupted pilgrimage during the years when plague was actively spreading. The gathering of pilgrims in crowded hospices, the movement of infected individuals along routes, and the general social disruption created by plague would have made pilgrimage particularly dangerous during plague years. Yet even the catastrophic plague epidemics appear not to have permanently ended pilgrimage, though they may have temporarily disrupted it and changed its character during particular periods. Bandits and highway robbery represented continuous risks for pilgrims undertaking extended journeys. The road was inherently vulnerable. Large groups of travelers with limited ability to defend themselves, carrying movable goods including cash or valuable objects, traveling through regions where state authority was limited, and encountering individuals willing to use violence for personal gain. The development of well-traveled routes and institutionalized support systems created some protection through increased community awareness and the presence of local authorities with interest in protecting pilgrims. But robbery and assault surely continued despite these protective developments. Some robbers specifically targeted pilgrims, understanding that travelers often carried whatever money they possessed, and that pilgrims might be reluctant to resort to violence in response to theft. The spiritual discipline of pilgrimage sometimes involved accepting such thefts as tests of faith or opportunities for demonstrating forgiveness. Yet for many pilgrims, the loss of resources could genuinely threaten the continuation of the journey. Political instability in the Iberian Peninsula created variable conditions for pilgrimage. When Christian kingdoms were fragmented or engaged in internal conflict, the stability of support systems for pilgrims could be disrupted, and local authorities might be less concerned with pilgrimage infrastructure than with maintaining military advantage. Conversely, successful Christian military campaigns and the expansion of Christian territorial control could strengthen institutional support for pilgrimage as a way of celebrating Christian authority and religious legitimacy. The political fragmentation of medieval Spain meant that pilgrims traveled through regions controlled by different and sometimes competing kings and nobles, each with different levels of interest in supporting pilgrimage and different capacity to maintain infrastructure and safety for traveling populations. Yet despite these challenges, the Santiago pilgrimage demonstrated remarkable persistence across centuries. The combination of spiritual motivation, institutional religious support, economic incentive, and the development of established infrastructure all contributed to the pilgrimage's ability to persist through disruptions. Communities benefiting economically from pilgrimage had incentive to maintain or restore infrastructure even after disruptions. Religious authorities maintained theological and institutional commitment to pilgrimage as a spiritually valid and important practice. And individual pilgrims, despite risks and difficulties, continued to undertake the journey in response to spiritual calling and the powerful meanings pilgrimage generated. This resilience across centuries of political, military, social, and environmental change testifies to the profound cultural and spiritual meanings the Santiago pilgrimage held within medieval Christian society. The early modern period witnessed significant transformations affecting the Santiago pilgrimage, as medieval religious and social structures gave way to new configurations of religious authority, state power, and cultural practice. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century challenged the theological underpinnings of pilgrimage and relic veneration, asserting that salvation came through faith and scripture, rather than through acts of religious works like pilgrimage. In Reformed territories, especially in Northern Europe, pilgrimage to Catholic shrines became suspect and eventually forbidden, which disrupted the flow of northern pilgrims towards Santiago. The Counter-Reformation response by the Catholic Church reaffirmed the spiritual validity of pilgrimage, yet the new emphasis on centralized church authority and reformed practices altered the character of pilgrimage from what it had been in the medieval period. The development of ocean-going maritime technology and the European encounter with the Americas redirected cultural attention and economic resources. The age of exploration diverted economic resources and adventurous spirit that might previously have been channeled toward pilgrimage. The dramatic expansion of European global reach and the reshaping of world trade patterns altered the significance of pilgrimage within Christian European practice. While Santiago pilgrimage continued, it existed within a transformed context of European religious and cultural experience, representing continuity with a medieval past rather than the cutting edge of Christian spiritual practice as it had been during the height of medieval pilgrimage culture. The Enlightenment and subsequent secularization processes gradually eroded the unquestioning acceptance of pilgrimage practices that had characterized medieval and early modern Christian society. As intellectual traditions emphasizing reason, science, and rational critique expanded, the miraculous claims associated with saints and relics became subject to skeptical interrogation. Relic veneration came to be understood by educated critics as superstition rather than legitimate religious practice. The theological frameworks that had made pilgrimage spiritually meaningful became less culturally dominant, replaced by forms of Christianity that emphasized interior spirituality and ethical practice over external devotional works. Pilgrimage numbers declined significantly, and the infrastructure that had supported pilgrims largely disappeared from communities along the routes. Yet, the Santiago pilgrimage did not vanish completely. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, small numbers of pilgrims continued to undertake the journey, maintaining continuity with medieval practice even as the broader cultural context that had supported pilgrimage had transformed beyond recognition. The revival and dramatic expansion of Santiago pilgrimage in recent decades represents a surprising development. The recovery of interest in medieval spiritual practices among contemporary populations seeking meaning and spiritual experience outside conventional institutional channels. Modern pilgrims walk routes established in the medieval period, encounter communities that have reformed around pilgrimage support, and recreate in contemporary form practices that emerged centuries ago. This modern revival demonstrates the enduring power of pilgrimage as a vehicle for spiritual seeking and the way historical cultural practices can be recovered and given new meaning in transformed social contexts. The architectural expression of Romanesque sacred building reached particular sophistication in the construction and decoration of pilgrimage churches, and the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela represents one of the finest examples of this architectural tradition. The cathedral's construction occurred over more than a century, with work beginning in the 11th century and major portions completed by the 12th century. The building rose gradually from the ground, each phase of construction reflecting the accumulated resources dedicated to the shrine and the evolving aesthetic preferences and building technologies of the medieval period. The cathedral's stone walls and soaring interior spaces represented tremendous architectural ambition and craftsmanship, reflecting the cultural importance attributed to the shrine and the religious significance of ensuring that pilgrims would encounter a building of appropriate majesty and spiritual presence. The sculptural decoration of the cathedral displayed remarkable artistic sophistication and theological complexity. The main entrance featured elaborate carved stonework depicting religious narratives and figures of spiritual significance. The carvings displayed both religious instruction, teaching biblical narratives and theological concepts to the illiterate majority who could not read written texts, and artistic achievement, demonstrating the skill and vision of medieval sculptors through elaborate and emotionally expressive figures carved in stone. The accumulation of sculptural detail created a thick informational environment in which multiple layers of meaning and significance could be read and interpreted by pilgrims approaching the shrine. The experience of encountering this architectural and sculptural elaboration would have constituted a profound sensory and intellectual experience for pilgrims, preparing them through visual and spatial experience for the spiritual encounter with the shrine that awaited in the cathedral's interior. The interior spaces of the cathedral were designed to accommodate crowds of pilgrims in movement while maintaining the sacred character of the interior. The wide nave allowed for circulation of pilgrim masses, while the ambulatory created specific pathways through which pilgrims could progress toward the shrine location without disrupting the liturgical life of the cathedral. The high ceilings and soaring arches created a sense of spiritual elevation, focusing attention upward toward the heavens and away from the material concerns of earthly life. The play of light through windows created dramatic visual effects that shifted through the day as the sun progressed across the sky, transforming the cathedral's interior through variations in illumination. The combination of architectural space, sculptural decoration, light effects, and the accumulated spiritual significance of the location created a multi-sensory environment designed to evoke spiritual experience and prepare pilgrims to encounter the sacred in a context of appropriate majesty and reverence. Beyond the cathedral itself, the cities and towns that developed around major pilgrimage destinations underwent distinctive architectural transformations. Streets were arranged to accommodate circulation of pilgrim masses, with plazas and open spaces serving as gathering areas. The architecture of pilgrim accommodations, hospices, inns, and other shelter facilities developed distinctive characteristics designed to efficiently accommodate large numbers of transient residents. Water systems were developed to serve the needs of concentrated pilgrim populations. The overall urban form of pilgrimage cities reflected functional accommodation to the needs of pilgrims, while also serving the permanent inhabitants who chose to make these locations home. The architectural and urban legacy of pilgrimage continues to shape these places today, with their basic urban forms and much of their built heritage still reflecting the medieval adaptations to pilgrimage infrastructure and practice. The architectural expression of pilgrimage extended beyond individual buildings to encompass the overall organization of landscape. Waymarkers, crosses, and small chapels were positioned along routes to mark the path and provide spiritual focus and shelter. These minor architectural elements, though individually modest, accumulated across the landscape to create a distinctive architectural and spiritual environment that marked the pilgrimage routes as sacred geography. The positioning of these markers often reflected careful attention to sight lines, visibility from distance, and the psychological and navigational needs of pilgrims moving through the landscape. The accumulation of these architectural traces, many still visible today though others have disappeared, marked the landscape itself as sacred space organized according to spiritual understanding and dedicated to pilgrimage practice. In recent decades, the Santiago pilgrimage has experienced unexpected revival and dramatic expansion as contemporary populations have rediscovered these medieval roots. This modern revival began slowly in the 1980s and has accelerated into the 21st century, with increasing numbers of contemporary pilgrims walking routes largely abandoned during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The revival reflects complex motivations and represents a fascinating case of historical recovery and contemporary spiritual seeking. Contemporary pilgrims report diverse reasons for undertaking the journey: spiritual seeking and desire for religious experience, personal transformation and psychological growth, engagement with historical and cultural heritage, physical fitness and the appeal of extended walking, and connection to community and shared experience of pilgrimage. The diversity of contemporary motivation contrasts with medieval understanding of pilgrimage as centrally motivated by religious devotion, yet it also reflects continuity in understanding pilgrimage as a vehicle for transformation and meaning-making. The infrastructure supporting contemporary pilgrimage has been substantially rebuilt and reorganized to accommodate modern travelers. Marked routes with distinctive trail markers make navigation straightforward for contemporary pilgrims, who often possess detailed guidebooks and sometimes use GPS devices to navigate. Modern accommodations, including hotels and hostels, supplement or replace the medieval hospices, while contemporary restaurants and shops serve pilgrim needs in ways adapted to modern expectations and services. The availability of prepared food, reliable shelter, and other modern comforts has transformed the physical experience of pilgrimage compared to the medieval period, making the journey feasible for populations of much wider age ranges and physical capacities than would have been able to undertake medieval pilgrimage. Contemporary pilgrims can expect reliable shelter and food rather than uncertain accommodation and the possibility of hunger. Yet, this modernization has also sparked reflection about what aspects of historical pilgrimage experience should be retained or recovered. Some contemporary pilgrims deliberately choose to minimize modern conveniences, seeking to approximate medieval pilgrimage experience through carrying possessions on foot, staying in simple accommodations, and accepting uncertain access to food and comfort. The desire to recover or approximate aspects of historical pilgrimage practice reflects understanding of the medieval pilgrimage not merely as instrumental means of reaching a destination, but as a practice in which the difficulty and uncertainty were themselves spiritually meaningful components. This tension between the comfort and convenience offered by modern infrastructure and the desire to recover aspects of historical difficulty reflects broader contemporary questions about how to engage with historical practices while maintaining contemporary life standards and expectations. The recovery of the Camino de Santiago in the late 20th century occurred within cultural context of growing environmental consciousness, interest in sustainable tourism, and skepticism of mass consumer culture. The Camino offered an alternative to motorized tourism, a way of moving through landscape that required bodily engagement and created direct sensory contact with place. The simplicity of pilgrimage, reduced to walking, small possessions, and engagement with others undertaking similar practice, appealed to contemporary populations experiencing information overload and complexity in their ordinary lives. The Camino represented a form of anti-modern cultural practice, a deliberate slowing and simplification of existence in ways that appealed to populations experiencing the acceleration and complexity of modern life. This cultural appeal contributed to the rapid growth of pilgrimage numbers and the expansion of infrastructure and services supporting contemporary pilgrimage. The Spanish government and various cultural organizations recognized the cultural and economic significance of pilgrimage and began deliberately to support its expansion and promotion. The routes were marked with distinctive yellow arrows and scallop shell symbols. Guidebooks and online resources provided detailed information about routes, accommodations, and services. UNESCO designated the pilgrim routes as World Heritage Sites, recognizing their historical and cultural significance and creating international recognition of their importance. Educational programs and cultural initiatives highlighted the historical significance of the routes and the cultural heritage they represented. This institutional support transformed pilgrimage from a marginalized and largely forgotten practice into a recognized and deliberately promoted cultural activity. The expansion of pilgrimage that resulted made the Camino one of the most well-known pilgrimage destinations globally and transformed the communities it passed through economically and culturally. The explosion in contemporary Santiago pilgrimage numbers has created interesting contemporary cultural phenomena. Pilgrims share experiences and create informal communities of common purpose, often exchanging contact information and maintaining relationships after completing the pilgrimage. The emergence of online platforms and social media groups dedicated to the Camino has created virtual communities in which contemporary pilgrims share information, ask questions, and maintain connections with others who have undertaken or are planning the pilgrimage. The experience of walking as part of a continuous stream of fellow pilgrims creates a sense of participation in ongoing practice, stretching backward into history and forward into the future, connecting contemporary walkers to medieval pilgrims and to countless future pilgrims who will undertake the same routes. This sense of historical continuity and participation in something larger than individual experience appears to be spiritually significant for many contemporary pilgrims, even those who do not identify strongly with religious frameworks. The transformation of the Camino into a popular tourist attraction creates interesting dynamics and potential tensions. Tourism brings economic benefit to communities and funding for maintenance of routes and infrastructure. Yet it also creates risks of commodification of pilgrimage practice, environmental impacts from heavy foot traffic, and potential alteration of the character and meaning of pilgrimage as it becomes mainstream cultural practice. The crowding of some sections of the route, particularly during peak seasons, creates experiences quite different from the solitude and contemplative conditions sought by some pilgrims. The proliferation of commercialized services tailored to contemporary pilgrim expectations reflects economic responsiveness to demand, yet it also represents potential deviation from aspects of historical pilgrimage experience that involved more authentic hardship and uncertainty. The balance between maintaining the accessibility and appeal of pilgrimage while preserving elements of challenge and authentic spiritual seeking remains an ongoing negotiation. The environmental impact of increasing pilgrimage numbers raises important contemporary questions. The heavy foot traffic on popular routes creates erosion and damage to landscapes, requiring active management and repair efforts to maintain ecological integrity. The infrastructure supporting pilgrimage, roads, shelters, water systems, creates environmental footprints and requires ongoing maintenance that consumes resources and generates material impacts. The growth of tourism and commercial activity associated with pilgrimage creates broader environmental and social impacts on communities along the routes. Yet offsetting these concerns is the environmental benefit created through alternative tourism that depends on walking rather than motorized transport, that encourages appreciation of landscapes in their natural state, and that potentially reduces environmental impacts compared to other forms of tourism that would otherwise consume the same economic and recreational resources. For contemporary pilgrims, the Camino often serves as a site of personal transformation and spiritual seeking, whether or not this is articulated in explicitly religious frameworks. The physical challenge of extended walking, the regularized rhythm of daily movement and rest, the engagement with landscape and sensory experience, and the encounter with fellow pilgrims create conditions for psychological reflection and personal transformation. Many contemporary pilgrims report experiences of clarity, insight, or resolution of personal questions or concerns during or after their pilgrimage journey. The removal from ordinary social context and familiar surroundings, combined with the meditative quality of repetitive physical movement, appears to create psychological conditions favorable to reflection and transformation. This psychological and spiritual appeal explains much of the pilgrimage's contemporary attraction and suggests reasons why the practice has recovered after centuries of decline and marginalization. The history of the Camino de Santiago, from its medieval origins through its modern revival, demonstrates the remarkable persistence of cultural practices and the way physical landscapes can hold meaning across centuries of transformation. The routes themselves exist as material infrastructure that has been maintained, modified, and rebuilt across generations, yet they retain essential continuity with their medieval predecessors. Pilgrims today walk pathways that pilgrims walked centuries ago, encounter many of the same landscape features and city locations, and experience the same fundamental encounter between embodied movement through space and spiritual or personal seeking. This continuity connects contemporary practice to historical tradition, creating chains of meaning and practice that stretch backward through centuries. The Camino also exemplifies how historical practices can be recovered and given new significance within transformed cultural contexts. The medieval Camino existed within a world of feudal political organization, unquestioned religious authority, limited geographical knowledge, and restricted mobility for most populations. The contemporary Camino exists within a globalized world of diverse religious beliefs and secular worldviews, democratic political organization, and unprecedented personal mobility and choice. That pilgrimage has revived and expanded so dramatically within this transformed context suggests that pilgrimage addresses enduring human needs for meaning, connection, and transformation that persist across significant social change. The fact that contemporary pilgrims undertake journeys fundamentally similar to medieval pilgrims, despite living within radically transformed circumstances, suggests something deep about human psychology and the appeal of embodied, spatially anchored practices of meaning-making. The physical landscapes through which the Camino passes have been transformed multiple times over the centuries, yet the routes themselves have remained relatively stable and have been recovered and maintained across periods of abandonment and disuse. The resilience of the routes themselves, their re-emergence and recovery as meaningful places even after centuries of marginalization, testifies to the power of landscape to hold cultural meaning, and to the way communities can collectively decide to recover and revive cultural significance in particular places. The recovery of the Camino in recent decades represents not innovation, but rather recovery and reconstruction. Yet this recovery involved deliberate choices by contemporary communities to recognize and support the historical significance of these routes and to create conditions for their contemporary use. The development of pilgrimage infrastructure along the routes, the establishment of hospices and shelters, the cultivation of hospitality traditions, the development of services and supplies, the creation of artistic and architectural responses to pilgrimage, created cultural patterns and community traditions that have demonstrated remarkable persistence. The hospitality traditions, in particular, appear to have been transmitted across generations and preserved in community memory even during centuries when pilgrimage numbers were minimal. The recovery of pilgrimage in recent decades occurred within communities that maintained cultural memory of these traditions, allowing contemporary pilgrimage to be welcomed and supported within frameworks of hospitality and support that had been culturally preserved despite having minimal practical application for centuries. The history of the Camino de Santiago reveals interesting relationships between religious and secular dimensions of pilgrimage. Medieval pilgrimage was explicitly and comprehensively embedded in religious frameworks and theological understanding. The journey was understood as spiritually meaningful, the destination as sacred, the practice as religiously prescribed or validated, and the motivation as fundamentally religious. Yet even within this religious framework, pilgrimage served social, economic, and psychological functions that extended beyond purely religious meaning. Social status could be enhanced through pilgrimage. Economic opportunities and trade connections could be developed through extended travel. Personal transformation and psychological growth could result from the extended journey and encounter with others. The religious framework encompassed, but did not completely determine the meaning and function of pilgrimage. Contemporary pilgrimage reveals interesting divergence between explicitly religious and secular motivations. Many contemporary pilgrims describe their motivations in explicitly religious or spiritual frameworks, understanding their pilgrimage as engaging with spiritual seeking, religious devotion, or personal transformation pursued through spiritual practice. Yet others describe their pilgrimage in explicitly secular frameworks, as hiking adventure, as cultural tourism, as personal challenge, as opportunity for social connection or community participation. The coexistence of explicitly religious and secular pilgrimage frameworks within the same practice demonstrates the multivalency of pilgrimage as a human activity. The fact that both religious and secular pilgrims undertake essentially the same physical practices and encounter similar landscapes suggests that pilgrimage addresses dimensions of human experience that are not exclusively religious, but that are deeply meaningful and significant. The transformation from medieval to contemporary pilgrimage also reveals changes in the relationship between individual motivation and institutional framework. Medieval pilgrimage occurred within strong institutional religious structures that validated and organized pilgrimage practice. Contemporary pilgrimage is often pursued by individuals or small groups within contexts of weak institutional religious authority, making pilgrimage potentially contested or uncertain in its religious validity. Yet contemporary pilgrimage appears to flourish despite, or perhaps because of, this shift in the institutional context. The freedom to pursue pilgrimage according to individual understanding and motivation appears appealing to contemporary populations, even, or perhaps especially, those with ambivalent relationships to institutional religion. The possibility of undertaking essentially traditional practice within secular or ambiguously religious frameworks offers opportunity to engage with historical and spiritual traditions while maintaining contemporary autonomy and freedom from institutional religious requirement or control. The Camino thus stands at interesting contemporary intersection of tradition and modernity, of religious and secular practice, of individual choice and community participation. The routes themselves represent tangible connection to medieval past, yet they are experienced and utilized by contemporary populations with values and understandings quite different from medieval pilgrims. The persistence of pilgrimage practice across centuries of transformation suggests something enduring about the appeal of embodied spiritual practice, the movement through landscapes seeking meaning or transformation, and the participation in communities united by shared practice or common destination. The recovery of pilgrimage in the contemporary moment represents significant cultural act of reconnection to historical tradition, revalorization of practices previously marginalized or abandoned, and recovery of understandings of meaning-making through bodily practice and spatial engagement that industrial and post-industrial modernity had largely displaced. The Camino de Santiago has generated profound and lasting influences on European history, society, and culture that extended far beyond the immediate practice of pilgrimage. The development of pilgrimage infrastructure required standardization and organization across diverse political jurisdictions and cultural regions, creating pressure toward common understandings of hospitality, service provision, and safety standards. While medieval political fragmentation meant that true coordination across all regions was impossible, the practical necessities of pilgrimage support created incentives for communication, cooperation, and mutual understanding between different Christian kingdoms and communities. The Camino represented one of the earliest forms of international infrastructure and service provision, prefiguring in important ways the later developments of modern transportation networks and tourism infrastructure. The artistic and architectural legacy of Santiago pilgrimage influenced the development of religious architecture across medieval Europe. The Romanesque style developed in connection with pilgrimage needs and was spread and refined through the construction of pilgrimage churches and pilgrimage-related building projects. The architectural solutions developed for Santiago pilgrimage, the ambulatory design allowing for circulation of crowds, the emphasis on large interior spaces, the sculptural and decorative programs communicating religious narratives were adapted and replicated in religious buildings throughout medieval Europe. Thus, the Camino influenced not only the specific buildings constructed along the routes, but broader architectural traditions that shaped religious buildings across the continent. The artistic and architectural legacy of medieval pilgrimage remains visible in the built environment today, with pilgrimage churches and their descendants continuing to shape European urban and rural landscapes. The movement of people, ideas, information, and cultural influences along the Camino routes represented significant dimensions of medieval cultural exchange. Pilgrims traveling from distant regions carried with them cultural practices, artistic styles, technical knowledge, and information about distant places that they encountered along the routes and at the pilgrimage destination. The establishment of communication networks along the Camino routes and the movement of pilgrims and merchants facilitated broader European cultural exchange and communication. The Camino thus represented one of the major communication and cultural exchange networks of medieval Europe, connecting distant regions and facilitating the transmission of ideas and cultural practices. In this sense, pilgrimage was not peripheral to medieval cultural development, but rather central to the processes through which cultural influences traveled across the continent and how diverse regions maintained connection to broader Christian European civilization. The development of pilgrimage support infrastructure and services along the routes also influenced the development of medieval commerce and the service economy. The concentration of travelers requiring food, shelter, and services created economic opportunity and incentive for merchants and service providers to develop specialized service provision. This development prefigured in important ways the later development of tourism industries and service economies. The Camino represented one of the earliest significant tourist infrastructures in European history, developing organized systems for accommodation, food service, information provision, and support services for mobile populations. Many of the principles and practices developed in response to pilgrimage needs would later be adapted and refined in response to other forms of travel and tourism. In the contemporary moment, the Camino continues to demonstrate cultural and spiritual significance, far exceeding its role as a specific pilgrimage route. The revived pilgrimage has generated substantial economic impact in Spanish communities, as tourism spending by pilgrims supports local businesses and employment. The cultural and artistic heritage associated with the Camino has been preserved and promoted, maintaining important historical buildings and landscapes as living heritage. The philosophical and spiritual significance of pilgrimage continues to resonate with contemporary populations, seeking meaning and connection in an increasingly complex and fragmented world. The Camino stands as testament to the enduring human need for embodied spiritual practice, for engagement with landscapes and communities, and for participation in traditions that connect us to human history and shared cultural heritage. Walking the Camino requires engagement with landscape and time in ways that contemporary life typically minimizes or eliminates through mechanical transportation and temporal compartmentalization. The experience of moving through landscape at walking pace, roughly 4 kilometers per hour, allows for detailed perceptual engagement with terrain, vegetation, weather conditions, and the accumulated traces of human habitation and activity visible in the landscape. Where motorized travel compresses distance into abstract temporal units and isolates travelers in protected capsules from direct engagement with environment, pilgrimage creates continuous exposure to and engagement with landscape. The quality of light shifts perceptibly through the hours of walking. The temperature fluctuates in response to microhabitat differences and elevation change, and the details of landscape emerge gradually and then fade as pilgrims move through it. This sustained perceptual engagement with landscape, day after day, allows landscape to be truly known in its complexity and variation, to be internalized as experienced place, rather than merely observed territory. The temporality of pilgrimage differs radically from industrial and post-industrial temporality, dominated by mechanical clock time and the segmentation of time into work and leisure, production and consumption. Pilgrimage time is organized around physical rhythms and landscape features rather than clock time. The day begins when light allows walking and ends when adequate shelter is found, rather than beginning and ending at prescribed hours. The rhythm of walking creates its own temporal pattern, with attention cycling through mental states as the day progresses. In medieval pilgrimage, the ability to predict progress and schedule arrival at subsequent destinations depended on physical capabilities and landscape conditions rather than on having calculated time in advance. Contemporary pilgrims often employ GPS and detailed knowledge to predict progress more precisely, yet many report that adopting a more flexible temporal organization allowing the day to unfold according to physical and environmental conditions rather than adhering to predetermined schedules, enhances the spiritual and psychological benefits of pilgrimage. The encounter with seasons and changing environmental conditions throughout extended pilgrimage creates experiential understanding of environmental cycles and the interconnection of human activity with environmental conditions in ways that contemporary life largely eliminates. Medieval pilgrims would have had immediate experiential awareness of how different seasons affected the landscape, what food plants were available, what water sources were reliable, what weather conditions posed dangers, and how human settlement patterns responded to environmental possibilities and constraints. This experiential knowledge of environment emerged through direct bodily engagement with landscape. Contemporary pilgrims, even those undertaking pilgrimage with modern conveniences and predictable access to food and shelter, still encounter seasons and environmental conditions with directness that is often absent from contemporary urban and mechanized existence. The extended experience of landscape and environment across seasons and weeks accumulates as embodied knowledge that differs substantially from abstract or visual knowledge of places acquired through media or brief visits. The transformation of landscape across centuries is visible to contemporary pilgrims who walk routes established in medieval times. Medieval landscape has been substantially transformed through changes in land use, development of new settlements, modification of forests and agricultural patterns, and the replacement of medieval communities with contemporary ones. Yet the fundamental topography persists. Mountains and river valleys maintain their essential features, and the routes that made sense for medieval travelers continue to make sense for contemporary ones. The contrast between continuity in fundamental landscape features and transformation in human-built environment and land use practices creates opportunity for contemporary reflection on human relationship to landscape and the ways societies transform their environmental relationships across historical time. The visible traces of medieval habitation and activity, ruined structures, agricultural terraces, archaeological sites, place names preserving medieval linguistic patterns, accumulate in the landscape and allow contemporary travelers to perceive multiple temporal layers simultaneously, to recognize themselves as moving through landscape inscribed with centuries of human activity and meaning. Pilgrimage exists in interesting tension between solitude and community. Medieval pilgrims undertook the journey alone or in small groups, yet they also participated in larger pilgrim communities that were continuously present on established routes. The probability of encountering other pilgrims on any given day would have been substantial, particularly during peak pilgrimage seasons and along well-established routes. Pilgrims encountered each other at hospices and wayside shelters, at market locations in significant towns, at church services and religious observances. These encounters facilitated exchange of information, mutual support, and the formation of temporary communities of fellow pilgrims bound together by shared goal and common experience. Yet pilgrims also experienced extended periods of solitude, walking alone through landscape, camping or sheltering alone in rural areas, experiencing the psychological states that accompany sustained solitude and bodily exertion. Contemporary pilgrimage continues this tension between solitude and community, though modified by contemporary culture and infrastructure. The dramatic expansion of contemporary pilgrimage means that well-traveled sections of routes see continuous streams of pilgrims, and encounters with fellow pilgrims are nearly inevitable during any day of travel. The availability of commercial accommodations and marked routes means that contemporary pilgrims are less likely to face the genuine uncertainty about shelter that medieval pilgrims might have experienced, yet they also encounter diverse communities of fellow travelers in shared accommodation spaces. Many contemporary pilgrims report that the community of fellow pilgrims, the exchange of information, advice, and personal stories with others undertaking similar journey, the sense of participation in collective human activity, represents significant portion of pilgrimage meaning. Yet some pilgrims deliberately seek solitude, timing their travel to avoid crowds, choosing less traveled route variations, and organizing their travel schedules to minimize overnight contact with other pilgrims. The creation of temporary communities among pilgrims appears to address psychological and social needs that persist across centuries of cultural change. Humans appear to benefit from experiences of community bound together by shared activity and common purpose, and pilgrimage creates such communities in structured ways. The common experience of physical challenge, the shared destination and motivation, the encounter with diversity of pilgrims from different regions and backgrounds, all these aspects of pilgrimage community appear psychologically and socially meaningful. Contemporary pilgrims often report formation of friendships and meaningful connections with fellow pilgrims that persist after the pilgrimage is completed, maintained through correspondence or social media connections. These post-pilgrimage relationships suggest that pilgrimage can serve as vehicle for formation of community connections that transcend the specific context of the pilgrimage journey itself. The hospitality traditions associated with pilgrimage reflect understanding of pilgrimage as creating ethical relationships between communities and pilgrims. The medieval monastic and community commitment to supporting pilgrims represented more than pragmatic response to the presence of traveling populations. It embodied religious understanding that hospitality to strangers and travelers was ethical obligation. This tradition of hospitality extends far back into Mediterranean and Near Eastern traditions and appears in multiple religious frameworks as core ethical principle. The recovery of pilgrimage in the contemporary moment has involved recovery and revitalization of hospitality traditions, with many communities expressing pride in their welcoming of pilgrims and their commitment to supporting pilgrimage in their localities. Contemporary pilgrims often comment on the warmth and generosity they experience from communities and individuals along the routes, suggesting that hospitality traditions have been substantially preserved even across centuries of minimal pilgrimage. As we rest contemplating the history and ongoing significance of the Camino de Santiago, we might recognize the profound continuities that connect contemporary pilgrims to medieval seekers who walked these same routes centuries ago. The landscape itself, the mountains and river valleys, the fields and forests, the settlements and sacred sites, creates continuity across time, offering pilgrims in any era the possibility of encountering terrain shaped by centuries of human presence and activity. The roads themselves, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, transmit the presence of all those who have walked before across the very ground contemporary pilgrims traverse. The shrine at Santiago endures as destination and focus of pilgrimage, holding meaning across transformations of religious understanding, political organization, and technological capacity. Yet contemporary pilgrimage also demonstrates the possibility of recovery and renewal, the chance to rediscover meanings and practices that have been marginalized or forgotten. The revival of the Camino in recent decades, after centuries of decline, demonstrates that cultural practices need not disappear permanently once they cease to serve immediate practical functions. The human need for meaning-making, for embodied spiritual practice, for engagement with places and communities, appears to persist across dramatic social transformations. The rediscovery of pilgrimage by contemporary populations suggests important truths about human nature and the kinds of experiences and practices that continue to seem meaningful even after centuries of devaluation or abandonment. In this sense, the modern Camino revival represents hope that other abandoned or devalued human practices and values might similarly be recovered and revitalized in response to contemporary spiritual and psychological hunger. The Camino de Santiago, in its full historical complexity and contemporary vitality, stands as testament to the persistence of human striving for meaning, transformation, and connection. From the medieval shrines drawing pilgrims across dangerous roads and challenging terrain to the contemporary routes walked by seekers from throughout the world, the Camino represents continuous human engagement with the possibility that spiritual seeking can be embodied, that landscapes can hold meaning, and that communities can be built around shared values and common destinations. The routes themselves, the hospices and shelters, the art and architecture created to support pilgrimage, and the countless stories of individual pilgrims undertaking the journey all contribute to a layered historical and cultural legacy that continues to inspire and guide those who choose to walk these ancient pathways. As your consciousness gently drifts toward rest, you carry with you the knowledge of these roots extending across centuries and continents, the awareness of countless pilgrims who have sought meaning in similar journeys, and the understanding that human search for spiritual and personal transformation remains continuous and vital across transformations of time and culture. The Camino de Santiago endures not as museum piece frozen in medieval past, but as living tradition continuously renewed by those who undertake the pilgrimage, who maintain the roots, who preserve the architectural and cultural heritage, and who continue to find in this ancient practice resources for meaning-making and transformation. Tonight, as rest claims you fully, the Camino continues its gentle work, waiting for those who will come tomorrow, and in countless tomorrows stretching into the future, calling across centuries to all who hear in their hearts the ancient invitation to journey toward Santiago and toward the transformative peace that pilgrimage promises.